It's nice to be here, and I want to thank Jennifer for inviting me. I want to thank Justine for fixing my phone. I thank Elijah for being here. And what's your name? Angie. Angie the honor student. That's her name, right. Angie the honor student for getting me some water. So this talk is in two parts. Parts of it are about the way I think about public art, or the way I came to think about public art, and then we're going to finish with some projects that I did, and one project that I tried to do that didn't work out, and then I guess we're going to open it up for questions, and you can ask me anything. I'll try to answer as best I can. This is a quote by James Baldwin. Thank you for that. Thanks, Justine. And it's one of the things I think about in my own practice as an artist. It's the way I think about how I approach all of my work, whether it's public or not public. And I used to live in Boston, and so this is, Boston is a city that's full of this kind of monumental, heroic sculpture. And this is not Boston, actually. This is right around the block. And I wanted to start with this image because I think it's instructive for what we're thinking about right now as a country, and especially when it comes to public art. Anyone know who Henry Ward Beecher was? Any of the young people here? Any of you know who he was? You can say no, just say no. Or maybe you do know who he is.
My students know.
Right, some of you know who he is, right? Okay, good. So 1891, none of us were alive in 1891. And none of us knew Beecher. And none of us knew the context of what was happening when this sculpture was made. But now we're left with this image, with this object that is made of a material that will last about 1,000 years. And the meaning of it has sort of dissipated over time. So when we, as contemporary people with contemporary eyes in 2019, come across an image or an object of someone ostensibly gigantic, sort of being worshipped by a black woman with no shoes and children, it kind of gives us a little bit of pause. So I was saying to Tom earlier, these aren't actual people. They're allegorical figures. They're figures that are referenced or rendered in order to make us think about something else. They're not supposed to be individuals. But that way of framing allegory is lost to us now because we don't share the same symbol systems. The woman is unshod because she is freed. You can see her ankles that are unchained. The woman is lying a laurel wreath, the symbol of victory, at the feet of Reverend Beecher. So for someone in 1891, all of these symbols would have had very important meaning. It would have been shared meaning. We all would have understood them. But now in a sort of moment where we don't have shared symbolic culture the way we used to, this kind of symbolism, it's hard for it to work outside of a given set of people. It's hard for that kind of symbolism to work outside of a closed system of culture. So as artists and as thinkers and as citizens, we have to start thinking about different ways to communicate with each other because we don't share the same core symbol system. This is around the block from my house on Nostrand Avenue. These kinds of images are all over Brooklyn. They are murals dedicated to young people who have lost their lives. I'm not here to judge how people lost their lives. I'm not here to make pronouncements about who's good or who's bad. But I can say that someone's friends and family cared enough about this loss to memorialize it on the side of a building, right? Yusef Hawkins died over a decade ago, and this mural is still extant. So that says something about the importance of this image to the community of the people who allowed it to be made. I saw this one yesterday in Bushwick. You know, and that is a beautiful painting. It's an exquisite rendering of this young man. It's almost like a Beaufort Delaney painting. It's beautifully done. And someone came and put a relic there to commemorate 10 years. So this is the way we memorialize people. When we say that people don't have memorials, or black people don't have memorials in New York, or women don't have memorials in New York, let's ask ourselves what we're really talking about. Are we talking about that black people don't have heroic sculpture all over New York representing them? Maybe they don't have it because they have something else that resonates more powerfully for them. And I am not immune or alien to the sort of anti-black power structures that prevent certain things from happening. I'm not saying that racism is not a thing. I am saying that we devalue the way that people image and memorialize their own lives and their own losses. We devalue those things. And so when they actually occur in public, we dismiss them as graffiti or tagging or things like that, when it really is this act of memorialization through the painted form, upon the built form, and in public. This is Felix Gonzalez Torres, artist who was one of the casualties of the AIDS epidemic. This is Untitled Portrait of Ross in Los Angeles. Ross was his partner. And this piece is in Chicago. And there's, I'm sorry?
It was in New York at the Met Royal a few years ago.
Yeah, it traveled here, yeah. In the collection in Chicago, I was fortunate enough to be in the gallery when a busload of school children came in. And it was the most amazing thing because the students see this huge pile of candy and they make a beeline for it, right? And the guard just says to them, he explains the whole story about Felix and about Ross and about how they fell in love and how they went to Los Angeles together, and it was a beautiful memory, and that Ross weighed 175 pounds when he was healthy, and the candy weighs 175 pounds. So as they take the candy, Ross gets smaller and smaller. He gets sicker and sicker. And then he explains this to children, to school children. And each one of them lines up and takes one piece of candy, instead of like digging in and jumping into it. So like you can't tell me that this form is not understandable. It's a form that's understandable even to children, right? And that is the kind of work, that is the kind of metaphor that we need in a contemporary moment. We have new metaphors for talking about the body. And the beautiful thing about this is the text from the museum. The beautiful thing about this is that Felix stipulated that the candy would be constantly replenished, right? And that's it's like a miracle. Like you come in one day and the pile's almost gone, and you come back the next day and it's right back where it was. So Ross is gonna live forever. And that's the kind of metaphor. He is able to grant someone eternal life through this new metaphor. Instead of making a painting of the resurrection, he actually creates the resurrection through a new metaphor. Right. This is in London. This is Hyde Park. There was a bombing in London on 7 July, terrorist bombing. Many people were murdered. And this park is a large public area. And this is the thing about the 7 July bombing. It happened to these people, but it happened to London, right? So we're not memorializing a personal loss. And this is the thing with these sorts of large-scale acts that are meant to horrify or terrify communities. They're not about a personal loss. They're an attack on the body politic, on the social body. So we have to have a response that is larger than friends and family, right? We have to respond in a way that is public, right? So what we see here are these Stella, these steel rods, essentially. They're aluminum, I think. And no, they are aluminum. I know they're aluminum. And they are each the same. They appear to be the same, but each one is different. So instead of being made in a bunch, you know, everything made all at once from one form, like an I-beam or something, each one is cast separately. So each one of these stela is as individual as the people who were lost. And that's what I mean. We're using these sort of technological systems to make sculpture, casting, that goes back thousands of years, but we're adding text and typefaces in ways that privilege digital sorts of duplication. So we have these methods that can rapidly create things. So what does it mean when we have a process that we could rapidly create these things and we slow it down so much that it becomes individualized, right? So you see when you come upon this object, it's almost like people standing in a field. You know, and the verticality of the objects reference the verticality of the body. And I have to tell you, the older you get, the more you value being able to stand up, right? And that is the most human thing, the desire to stand up when everything in life is pulling you down towards the ground. As a human, you have the ability to stand, to rise. And this sort of gesture, where the individualized columns stand in places for people who are no longer with us. I think that's the sort of, that's the new metaphor. Okay. This is Germany. This is Buchenwald, concentration camp, where there was a lot of medical experimentation. Not experimentation, medical torture. Let's call it what it was, medical torture. And when the camp was liberated, the people who came from all different places built this wooden obelisk to commemorate their liberation. Because it was wood, it decayed, and it was gone. So Hoheisel and Nitz architecture firm were famous for something called the Unmonument. Right? Wrote this proposal for this monument at Buchenwald, which was hugely influential to me in my own practice. Because how do you memorialize a loss? How do you make a place where there is no place? How do you evoke a human presence without making a kitsch image of a person? How do you do that? Hoheisel and Nitz did it with heat. So they used the footprint of the original obelisk and built this stainless steel plate, stainless steel, which is a medical sort of material, right? And heated it to the temperature of the body. And this part of Germany is rather cold. So you see people kneel down and touch it to put their hands on it, and you're immediately connected. It's exactly like touching another person's body. So that notion of presence is evoked without this sort of kitsch representation of, quote unquote, the suffering prisoner, right? Because that's the image that we think about. We think, oh, a concentration camp, people suffered. If we're going to make a memorial, let's make images of people suffering so people will know what it was like. It's not necessary. It's not. You can evoke people's presence, right? I put this picture in because I miss him. And it was also very telling for me because former President Reagan went to Bitburg Cemetery where SS soldiers were buried. And Reagan and Obama went to Buchenwald. So. So that's the first part. And if you fell asleep, you should wake up for this part, because this is my work. So if you came, you're probably going to be at, Professor Wingate is probably going to give you an exam on this or something, so you should probably pay attention. So I am a college professor. I'm the son of an auto worker and a Medicare billing clerk. I had a sabbatical from my job, and a sabbatical is when they pay you to not come to work for a whole year, so you can work on your other stuff. And that had never happened to me or anyone in my family ever. So I was so thrilled to be able to concentrate on my own work. But while I was concentrating on my own work, many, many, many Black people were killed by the police during that year. And it was something that was on the news almost every day. I remember coming back on an airplane and getting off the plane at Logan Airport and walking through the international arrivals terminal and seeing on the monitor the last moments of Eric Garner's life. And I remember thinking, why is that on television? Like, why are you allowed to show the end of someone's life on television? And they showed Tamir Rice being killed in a drive-by over and over again. It's like, why, like, I'm old enough to remember when there was a prohibition against showing the end of someone's life on television. Now it's common, and it's very common when the victims are Black. I remember there were two white newscasters who were murdered while they were broadcasting, and suddenly everyone, don't share the video, take it down from Facebook, nobody watch it, right? But, you know, you can still see these videos of people losing their lives, and it remains deeply troubling to me. And I have a lot of white friends and family who were completely oblivious to this happening. And they kept saying, like, how was your sabbatical? Are you enjoying your sabbatical? And I'm like, do you know what's going on? Like, are you aware? And they weren't. So this is what I did. I did some research, and I found all the names of all 262 Africans or African Americans who were killed by police or who died in police custody from the beginning of my sabbatical to the end of my sabbatical for an entire year. So there's 262 names on that wall. I painted the wall the color of a sidewalk, and I worked with my neon fabricator, Carmine Sicardo, to make that sign that says a dream in the color of police light. So the wall is illuminated by this police light. So it's almost like, on the one hand, looking at a gravestone, but on the other hand, looking at a sidewalk, right? So this is the same piece installed in a different location. We had a larger expansive wall to use there. And you can see here, it goes the date, the name, the gender, the age, city, state, and method of killing. I had a show last year. No, was it last year? Or was it earlier this year? I think it was earlier this year. Anyway, I had a show at Gallatin Galleries at NYU. And this is facing Broadway. This is the same piece. And we did it as vinyl text on the window. So usually that method is to let people know that there's a sale or some sort of information about what's going on inside, but instead it's this large-scale record of state-sponsored murder that's facing the street. Now this is at the Gardner Museum. Mrs. Gardner it's a house museum. It's kind of like the Frick, but it's the way Mrs. Gardner has installed the galleries has more to do with her personal relationships with the artists and the objects. So it's a very idiosyncratic museum. And artists love it because it's like walking through this sort of large-scale installation. And I was the artist in residence there for about 5 weeks, so I got to live at the museum, which did not suck. It was really nice. And they asked me if I wanted to make a piece for the facade of the building. And so I made this work, which is a memorial for Freddie Gray, a man who was murdered by the Baltimore Police Department. For the art historians in the room, I do have to say, I know that Mrs. Gardner did not like having people in her museum. Okay, I know. I had to say that for the video, just to make it sound nice. But I know she really did not like having people in her museum. So these are the source photos for this work. So Freddie Gray at home in his neighborhood, Freddie Gray being arrested by the Baltimore Police Department, and Freddie Gray on life support. It was very important to me that Mr. Gray be alive in all of the work. So I didn't want to use an image of him dead. And I went into my studio and I used Photoshop to average all the pixels. So I would get 3 monochrome colors. And then I made paint. So I mixed the color of the paint. And then I went to Benjamin Moore with a little sample, and they made latex paint for me. And I had the jars sandblasted, so this is a smaller version of this memorial. Right? I actually had a woman on the internet ask me what one of the colors was, like how to make it, because she wanted to paint her daughter's room that color. And I was so horrified, but like sometimes, like my friend Lynn Tillman said, she said, sometimes you can't even see past your own daughter's bedroom. You just can't even see past it. So I sent her a list of colors that were based on the murders of other black people. I just sent her a list of colors. I didn't hear back from her. So Hank Willis Thomas, who Professor Wingate was telling you did the piece Unity, he has a political action committee called For Freedoms, F-O-R Freedoms. And in advance of the midterm elections, they got 50 different artists to make billboards all over the country that were about politics. This is my billboard, Freddie Gray, in Des Moines, Iowa. This is a digital version of it. And this is the same work in Baltimore, a few miles from where Mr. Gray was arrested at the community center. And this is the paint on the walls of the Hillsborough Community College Gallery in Florida, which is a state that had one of the highest percentages of lynchings in the country. So I was artist in residence for the city of Boston. And Boston is the city that has the first free public library in the country. You used to have to pay to go to libraries. So there were libraries, but most of them were people's personal collections. So this is the first free public library in Boston. And when I moved to Boston almost 30 years ago, I went there all the time because it was free, number one. And I looked for an apartment there, and I looked for a job when I was there, and it has a beautiful collection of art. So I have this long relationship with this place. So when I became artist in residence, I wanted to do a project about the publicness of the library. So I have this statement that I think about. This is me thinking about the library. I remember everything you taught me here. And so the proposal was to put it on the front of the library as a flag, right? People told me, the city told me that I couldn't advertise on the front of the library. So wait a minute, this isn't advertising, this is art. Right? So I'm already having to have a conversation with the city about the appropriateness of talking about my love for the library, right? So people were very opposed to it in the beginning, but then it happened, right? After much argument and meeting with people, many, many people in the city, until I finally got to the president of the Boston Public Library, who was like, oh yeah, it's a great idea. So then it just happened. Like when one person said yes, everybody said yes. Because I think a lot of things that happen in public art is that nobody wants to get in trouble. Nobody wants to greenlight something that's going to be controversial, right? So, and then when it was up, everybody wanted it, right? So my original plan was to have the flags travel to all the branch libraries in Boston in the order in which they were established, right? And all the librarians in the branches were like, oh no, we couldn't possibly do that. Where would we put them? We can't hang them, right? Then they saw this picture and they were like, oh my God, we have to have those here, right? So then it became like a thing, right? And it was great because it started to travel all over the city. And so I had these books made, these memory books. So every branch library has one of these books and people can write down their memories of the library. And these are now in the collection of all the different branch libraries. So this is the Adams branch, right? This library is probably the best library I have ever been to. I've been making a lot of friends in this library, especially Barry and Abraham. They were close friends. And the nicest librarian I've ever met was Mrs. Megan. Also, I love the books at this library and the computers that we got to play on. And this library helped me with homework a lot, such as math, reading, and writing. Thank you, Adams Street Library. And he drew a dragon, which is, like, that's awesome. Like, that's just great. Like, you know what I mean? Like, who else gets to talk about how much they love the library so much? Yeah. So this is the last project. This is Boston, the Commonwealth Mall, which is a large stretch of Commonwealth Avenue that has a lot of memorial architecture and a lot of memorial sculpture. And part of the vernacular understanding of Boston is this place, because on this stretch of road, there are these plaques embedded in the ground that are, you can pay to have a loved one memorialized in one of these plaques. You can buy a bench or you can buy one of these plaques. And some of them are really specific and some of them are really insular. Like, I don't know who Frank and Jerry were, but this, you know what I mean? So it's this way of remembering something in public, right? Now, this is Faneuil Hall, which is a marketplace in Boston. And Peter Faneuil was a trader. He traded goods and he traded people, because that's what people traded back in the colonial period. And there was no established market building in Boston, so he built one. And so in a way, he's just, he's not like a founding father. He's like a real estate developer. He's like, you know, just someone who built a building that was useful for him. And he gave it to the city at the end of his life, right? So when we think about the colonial period in Boston, that street there that you see called Merchants Row that goes in front of Faneuil Hall, that was a place where there were merchants. And the merchants traded people and property and insurance and mortgages on people's lives, because enslaved people were valuable. They were an asset. So you could take out a mortgage based on how many enslaved people you owned. So I did a lot of research about colonial Boston, and this was part of my residency as an artist in the city. And this is a known thing. And this is the thing about Boston, is that everybody knows this history, but no one talks about it. And it's not marked anywhere, you know. And this is Peter Faneuil. Peter Faneuil summed up the preferences of many Bostonians, asking Peter Buckley to procure for him, quote, as likely a straight-limbed West Indian Negro lad as possible you can about the age from 12 to 15 years. So that one sentence tells you so much. One, that people are looking for a particular kind of person to enslave. So that might mean that there's some sort of breeding program for human beings, right? This is the colonial period, right? And this is, 2002. Robert DeRosiers is doing this research. So this is not an unknown thing, right? So I go to Faneuil Hall and I see a slave market. That's what I see when I'm there, right? And that's what was there, right? But there's no marker, there's no indication, there's nothing, right? So as an artist, working with the built form in memory, I propose to make a monument that honors those people, right? And how do I do that? What's the new metaphor that I use? Because like I said, we can't make a image of a suffering slave because that metaphor is lost to us now. And there is a small plaque on the side of Faneuil Hall that says, "Still in use by a free people," right? So even knowing that there are free people sort of posits that there are people who are unfree. That's the only sort of acknowledgement that you see anywhere around here. So this is the map of the transatlantic trade that I was thinking about when I was working on the project. And this is sort of a diagram of an auction block, right? Large area where enslaved people would stand, smaller area where an auctioneer would stand, right? And to break it down to this form, I started to think about what form the auction block would take. So instead of building an actual auction block, because I'm not building the real thing, it's a metaphor, right? I started to think about how much space was allotted people during the transatlantic trade. 2 people would be in an area of 3 by 5 feet, right? Packed together, yeah? They even had a phrase, loose pack or tight pack for human cargo. So the proposal was to map the transatlantic trade onto this plate and have the model of the slave ship to demonstrate what the packing would have been like, and to install this in front of Faneuil Hall at grade as a plate, just like those other plates I showed you before, the Commonwealth Mall, and to heat it to the temperature of a human body. So it would activate that sort of memory of the presence of those people, right? So thinking about all the different metaphors about displacement, about loss, about oppression, all that sort of stuff, synthesizing those metaphors into this work. And over the course of the development of the work, we started to research which ships Peter Faneuil owned, where they came from. So we were getting very, very specific about how we were going to create this plate. And it's a public art process. So I went to everyone in Boston. I was one of the city's artists in residence. I had to go to the mayor and get his approval, and then I had to go to Public Works, and I had to go to Buildings and Grounds and the National Park Service, and the people who sweep that street. I had to get approval from them. And I did all of this. Like I went with this proposal and made an argument that this needed to be done, and I got all these people to agree. And that agreement was important because I couldn't have a public hearing about the work unless I had all of these people who had agreed to it. That's the way it worked in Boston. So I got everybody from the city on board, which, not to brag, okay, but a black man got people in Boston to agree to build a memorial about the history of enslavement in the city, right? So I did that, right? Nobody else helped me do that. And I think the fact that I did that by myself made a lot of people angry. And so what ended up happening was the Boston branch of the NAACP opposed the project, and they opposed it publicly. And so if they opposed it, the mayor would have had to have withdrawn his support. And so the whole thing just sort of collapsed after that. And it's devastating for me. It's actually very hard for me to talk about. And I appreciate your your patience with me. But it shows that it's very hard to make art in the public realm because there are all these other agendas at play that do not privilege the voice and the work of the artist, right? Nobody asked me to do this. And people made all sorts of incredible claims about me. It was interesting to hear Professor Wingate talk about what happened at the other, with Simone Lee's piece. I was called a house Negro. I was called a pawn of a white mayor. All these sorts of things by black people. And you know, I love black people. Like, I've been black all my life, right? And it's not like those people are blacker than I am. Like, it's just, it was weird. And what ended up happening was I had to withdraw the work because the conversation stopped being about memorializing the lost and started being about something in which I wasn't interested. So people were using my work to advance their own agenda because there's a lot of people in Boston who don't like the mayor, right? And so to avoid any more of this sort of nonsense, I just withdrew the work. And I would love to build it. I would love to build it. And I still have the tiniest bit of hope that it could be built in Boston, but this story is the entire eastern seaboard of the United States, right? So I think that I can find another place to do this work if Boston doesn't want it. And I've had interest from other cities, which has been great. And I think, wait, I have one more slide. Right, so we started to get really, really specific about the number of vessels that Faneuil owned, where they came from, and the next part of our research was prototyping. And so I did a Kickstarter to raise money to build a prototype, and that went really, really well. And I think that was the other thing. I think that people looked and thought, this guy is gonna raise this money to do this, and we're not included. And I think that was another part of why it fell apart. And that's it. Thank you very much. Can you bring the lights up, Justine? Thanks so much. Justine, everybody. Can we give Justine a hand? I'm happy if people have questions to try to answer them to the best of my.
Sorry, if this is uncomfortable for me to discuss, I understand. But I'm curious, what was the problem that the NAACP had with what you were trying to do, at least on the surface?
I know you.
Yeah, I'm Michelle.
Yeah. How are you? Oh my God. She's my Twitter friend. Like, we've never met in real life. This is amazing. How are you? Wow. She's really awesome. Like, if you're not following her on Twitter, you need to. I'm gonna explain it, but I want you to know that it makes no sense. Like, so I just want you to, like, because
A lot of things make no sense.
like, I play this over and over again in my head. Essentially, Boston is having a conference, an NAACP convention next year. They're hosting it. This year's conference was in Detroit. I grew up in Detroit. So the mayor was putting together a delegation of people from Boston to go to Detroit, and my name was on the list, right? So the head of the NAACP saw my name and said he can't go because we oppose his project. So that was the first I heard about it. So of course I was like, well, why do you oppose my project? And she sent me an email saying that the only thing she knew about my project was what she had read in media reports, and that it was against the mission of the NAACP. Right. It's just, I mean, whatever, this is what she, and I have the email. It's, you can actually read my Kickstarter page. The email's posted there. So I responded like, you know, I'm really, like, when I got this gig to be the artist in residence for the city, I called the NAACP and no one called me back. This is back in January, right? And I said, I'm really sorry that I'm one of the few tenured black faculty members at a leading college of art and design in the city. And like, I'm really sorry that I'm one of the few black people in Boston to ever have a solo exhibition at the ICA in Boston. And I'm really sorry that I'm one of the few black artists who's been selected as an artist in residence for the city, and you don't know anything about me. Like, I'm sorry that you don't know that, and I'm sorry that you couldn't figure out how to send me an email when I have like a public email address. I'm sorry you couldn't figure that out. So I don't know what to tell you. Like, I don't know, because I would think that you would be happy that someone had succeeded, like that a colored person had advanced, right? I think that you would be happy about that, but clearly she wasn't. And so, I know that this is being recorded and simulcast, and I have no you-know-whats to give about this whole thing, but I think it's been very bad for them. It's been an embarrassing thing for them. And it's part of the reason why I didn't feel like I could continue to make public work in Boston. And New York has been lovely. People have been lovely to me here. And like I said, thank you for your compassion. This is exceedingly difficult for me to talk about publicly, but I'm happy to try to do it because I want to have this dialogue. So many people in Boston claim to want to have dialogues about race, and they were saying that my work was getting in the way of that dialogue. So I withdrew my work. I'm like, so where's your dialogue? Like, go ahead, why aren't you talking? Like, and no one's talking, right? And the mayor, who is a wonderful man, someone asked him what he thought about what happened. He said, this is typical Boston. And he said, what's gonna happen is Steve is a smart guy. He's gonna go build this somewhere else, and people in Boston will say, how come we can't have something like that here? That's exactly what's gonna happen.
Todd Fine with CUNY Graduate Center. So I want to expand a little bit on that question. I know it's provocative, but I have a thought that came from your presentation. You started out the presentation by saying that traditional sculpture, society can't deal with it because we don't have these shared symbols of allegory. And some people would say maybe we should, or that's still possible. And you kind of lay out another alternative, which is, I see a sort of a technological language of meaning, which you talk about lists and sort of branded flag. That's my interpretation, kind of a branded flag, and then also these kind of geometrical things, which I agree is contemporary with our era, which is these kind of technological ways to express meaning or symbols that people are comfortable with, rather than the traditional allegorical symbolist structure. Mm-hmm. But then I wonder if the controversy in Boston came because people expected that's what in their mind was a proper memorial to slavery, would be something, a more traditional sculpture like you described as kitsch. Maybe that's what they wanted, and maybe that's why they objected to I know it wasn't there, but it seems to me, given the presentation, that could be a question. And I think that raises questions for us in New York, where the mayor's, She Built NYC project, for instance, is sort of privileging a traditional statue framework rather than a more, a different type of language. So do you feel that may have been part of the criticism? I don't know the situation in Boston.
I think that there's two parts, Todd. I think that the first part is that, we're not trying to, it's a difficult history. Like, it's not what's his name? Brian Stevenson says, from the Equal Justice Initiative. He says, we do a lot of celebrating in America. We want to celebrate all this sort of stuff. We want to celebrate civil rights, and we want to celebrate this. It's like, can we just talk about where all the bodies are buried first? Like, let's do that work. And then we can get on to celebration. And so my work is about digging up the bodies and showing where they're buried, and also showing who killed them. Like, that's a big part of what I feel like my work is as an artist. And I grew up in Detroit, and so I never thought that there was anything wrong with being black. And I've noticed that a lot of black people in other places are really ashamed of being black. And they really want this, they want artists to make images and artwork that makes people feel good about blackness. And I never really had that need because I never thought that there was anything wrong with it. And so that's part of where I come from as an artist. And there's a lot of people in Boston, and I'm not ashamed to say that a lot of people in Boston are very uncomfortable with the thought of talking about black people in slavery. A lot of black people who are uncomfortable with it. Because they want to talk about, like, we were kings in Africa and all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, you know, you should read a book. Like, you should really, like, Susan Preston Blyer, C.L.R. James, W.E.B. Du Bois, y'all should read some books about that. Like, because that's a whole mess, right? And so when you have these people who are invested in correcting a narrative of racism with positivity, right? That's where you get into the discussion of kitsch, right? Because it has to be like a positive image of people. And like, what does that even mean? Like, black people aren't all good, they aren't all bad, they're just people. Maybe we could treat black people like people, right? And that is the thing, because this country, America's relationship to black people is violence. And it's always been violence. And it's always been violence in the service of a domestic identity. Like, white women can feel safe because we do this to black men. Like, that's what all of that is, right? And so when you are immersed in that, and when you grow up in a culture that doesn't, that treats you like there's something wrong with you for being black, which is a lot of what happens in Boston with black people, you're sort of poisoned into thinking that there's something wrong with you. Like James Baldwin says, the world will oppress you so much that the world won't have to oppress you. You just do it to yourself, right? And that's a lot of what is happening with black people in Boston, in my opinion. That they're so locked into this white supremacist narrative that they can't imagine another way. And I'm like, maybe we could not talk about white people. Like, let's just talk about black people. Let's just not even talk about that. Like, why is that the center of the discourse, right? Oh, people are, I gotta tell you, Todd, I talked to like maybe 200 white people to get this project built, and they were all like, oh yeah, we should do that. We should really do that, because we haven't done that ever, right? So that was like, what was the problem?
Steve, I'm with my class, and and it's ironic that you started with the Beecher,
Mm-hmm.
and with Beecher,
Mm-hmm.
and with the question about the Yusef Hawkins mural versus the Beecher, that was very evocative. What about the fact that the Beecher is here in the present with its narratives, but it's here in the presence in a premier Brooklyn site of memory, while the Yusef Hawkins is on Nostrum and probably is seen by a lot less Brooklynites.
Mm-hmm.
What do you propose to do with the Beecher?
I like the Beecher. I mean, I think when it was made, his family hated it because it wasn't a good likeness. Like, which is sort of like a diss to John Quincy Ward. But this is the thing, right? I believe that it's my job as a teacher to teach that monument and to teach the context of that monument. Because that's what we're doing. We're doing this thing like, no one has a right to not be offended. I remember being in like in graduate school and seeing a Philip Guston painting of a Klansman. And I was like, what the actual, like, why am I looking at this? Like getting all heated, right? And then I read a book, right? My teacher made me read a book about Philip Guston, like to learn. Like this whole notion that like this object offends me, therefore it must be removed. No, that's a teaching opportunity. All those Confederate monuments that are up all over the place, people want to tear them down, and I totally understand that. You know what I would do? I would put up a big sign that says, this thing was put here by white people to make black people feel bad about themselves. That's why this is here. So when you look at this is a monument to white supremacy. Just to put it in the right context. So people know, like, and people would say to me, like, because there's this whole thing about changing the name of Faneuil Hall. Like, black people are hurt by the name Faneuil Hall. I was like, Black people are getting shot by the police. Black people going off and dying in a sand pit in Iraq. Like, black people are fine with the name of Faneuil Hall. They have other things to worry about. Like, the problem is that how we tell the truth in public. Like, all I ever wanted to do was tell the truth. That's all I wanted to do. And, you know, there's I can't remember the director, but there's a film, a Polish film called The Nasty Girl. Have you ever seen it? It's about this girl. She lives in this town in Poland, and it's kind of a comedy, but it's kind of not. And she's just trying to do her homework, so she's researching her town, and she finds out her town is filled with Nazis. She's just trying to do her homework, right? And so it's that kind of thing. Like, the artist comes along and like discovers this thing, or makes this gesture, and like, it's not about me. That's about you. The NAACP's opposition, that's about them. It's not about my work. And that's what a good artwork does. It makes, like, when I'm looking at that Beecher statue, I'm not thinking about John Quincy Ward. I'm thinking about Beecher, because that's the job. When you look at these sort of kitsch monuments that are proposed, you're thinking about the artist when you look at them. You're not thinking about the thing that it represents. That's the problem. You okay?
I'm good. I'm just trying to remember the word I was going to say.
Okay.
What are the city has like asked or like had interest in the last footage to show us?
Rhode Island has been interested. Rhode Island is a killing field for slavery. It really is. And I've been talking to people in Philadelphia, actually, as well, oddly enough, which I never expected to have a conversation with them. And there's also like a sort of push to have a temporary version of it, which I had never thought of, you know, one that can move to different places. And so I have a wonderful lead architect named Patty Seitz and a wonderful draftsman named Julian Phillips that I'm working with of different versions of the piece. So it still has a life, you know. You know, of course, as an artist, you want the thing to be where you imagined it to be, right? But if it can't be there, I'm just grateful that people are interested in having it be somewhere.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.